Hey guys, welcome to Mrs. G's Sewing Space. Today I'm going to show you how to make a tiered skirt. It's really simple. There is some measurements and calculations that you have to do, but I work it all out with you in the beginning. If you have any questions, remember to throw those comments down below so I can answer your questions. And always remember to like the video, give me a thumbs up if you can, and always share the video with your family, friends, and whoever you want to share it with. So you can also make the skirt with your friends if you want, or maybe I should plan a sew along or something like that. I don't know. Anyways, I'm going to make a couple more of these, but I think I might find some different materials. This skirt was made out of a quilting cotton that I got from Joann's. I went straight to their cotton fabric. Everybody was looking for fabric for masks, but I wanted a skirt. It's a little stiff. The fabric is a little stiff, but it'll soften up as I wash and wear it. And so I'm going to make this skirt, and it's fabulous. And I hope that you enjoy the video, and I'll see you there on the other side. We need to take a measurement around our hips, and I'm not going to show you my hips because I got mom belly and it's embarrassing. But when you, let's draw. So we're just going to say this is your body. So there's your butt, and this is your belly. Now, I'm not an artist by any means, but you need to measure around the curviest part of your belly and your hips. So this would be your waist. So we're going to draw a line here. Waist. And the roundest part of your butt and your hips, so we'll put a hip here, is where you need to measure. So for this skirt, you need to measure around your booty. For this skirt, you don't need to measure around your waist, because when you pull on the elastic, you need to have the widest part of your body, which I do. So when you measure a skirt, you either go around your waist and your hips and then the length. But for this skirt, you need to measure around your hip, because more than likely that's going to be the widest part of your body in order to be able to fit it over your butt and hips and your waist. So my hip, around my hip was like 42 inches, I think mine was. Mine was 42 inches. So I'm going to use 42 inches, and I'm going to add 4 inches for ease, meaning it's not going to be super tight. It'll still be close to my body, but it gives me room to move. So my total would be 46 inches. So this is the measurement that I'm going to use, 46 inches to start the measurement for my skirt. Okay, now that we know how much around your hip you need. For my case, we decided that it was 46 inches, or I decided it was 46 inches because that works for me. I am now going to figure out each of my tiers. So for my skirt, I decided that I wanted 4 tiers. My first 3 tiers are going to be the same width, and my bottom tier was going to be shorter width, just to give me a more ruffly kind of look at the bottom. So my first tier, I'm just going to draw a line here. My first tier, from my waist, which is what this point is, from my waist to my hip is 9 inches. So I'm just going to put a W here for my waist, and this is going to be my hip. So from my waist to my hip is 9 inches right here. And we're going around the measurements. So around would be 46 inches. So this is just to give you an idea of how I came up with my calculations, because sometimes I have to visualize. So we're going to make a rectangle here. So the final product will be 9 inches by 46 inches. But you have to add your seam allowance, and you need to add your casing. So for a seam allowance at the bottom, I'm going to add a 1/2 inch. So 0.5. At the top, I'm going to add a casing. So I decided for a fold-over elastic waistband, which is what the skirt requires, and for the fold-over elastic waistband, my elastic is going to be 1 inch. So I'm going to fold it over by 1 inch. So that's what this is going to be. My waistband is going to be 1 inch. And then you need a seam allowance on top of that, which would be a 1/2 inch. So right here, 0.5. So the width to my first tier is going to be 9 plus 1 plus a half, which is 9, 10, 11. So 11 inches. So my first tier is going to be 11 inches by 46 inches. And I'm going to put a circle here for the first tier. Now my second tier, I'm going to draw down. My second tier is going to be a little wider. So my second tier needs a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Then it will be 9 inches, because I remember I decided my tiers are going to be 9 inches wide. I'm just going by from my waist to my hip measurement, which is 9 inches in my case. So my second tier is going to be 9 inches wide, but I need a 1/2 inch seam allowance here at the top, and I need a 1/2 inch seam allowance here at the bottom. So that would be 9 plus a half, which would be 10 inches here. And for the length of my tier to create the ruffle, it needs to be longer than the top tier. Now this is where it gets a little wonky. So you can have a lot of ruffle, or you can have just a little bit of ruffle, or you can have somewhere in the middle. So I did somewhere in the middle where I didn't do a ton of ruffle, but I definitely wanted I wanted you to be able to know that I had a ruffle there. So what I decided to do is I took the around my hip measurement here for the first tier, and I divided it in half. So I did 46 divided by 2. So 46 divided by 2 gives me 23 inches. So I decided to take that 23 inches and add it to 46. So 46 plus 23 is 69 inches. So for right now, 69 inches is going to be the second tier. So 10 inches by 69, and that's going to be tier 2. So I'm going to do the same calculations for tier 3. So I'm going to draw my line here, and this one's going to be a little longer. So it's going to be the same. My tier is going to be 9 inches finished, but I do need a 1/2 inch seam allowance here, so 0.5, and a 1/2 inch seam allowance here on the bottom. So that's going to be 0.5. So my total is going to be 9 plus a half, which would be 10. And then I'm going to do the same calculation here. So I'm going to take the total of the second tier, which is 69, and I'm going to divide it in half. And this is just how I came up with my calculations, how I wanted it. Divide it in half, which gives me 34.5. I'm just going to drop that decimal because I'm like, I would just round to whole numbers, but I'm going to go ahead and just round down. So then I'm going to take 69 plus 34, and that will give me so 69 plus 34 is 103. So my third tier is going to be 103 inches. So 10 by 103, and that's going to be tier 3. Now my fourth tier, I decided that I didn't want a full size ruffle with 9 inches, because then it would be floor length and it would be too long. So I decided to go for a 3-inch ruffle instead. This is going to be a really long ruffle right here. So once again, I added a 1/2 inch seam allowance at the top, and I added a 1/2 inch seam allowance here at the bottom, both being a 1/2 inch, just like I said. So since I decided it was going to be a 3-inch tier, 3 plus a half would give me 4 inches. And I took that bottom ruffle right there, or that third tier, I divided it in half, which gives me 51. So 103 divided in half, gives me 51.5. So once again, I'm going to drop that half just because I would rather deal with whole numbers. So then I'm going to take that 103 plus 51, 103, plus 51, which gives me 154. So for tier 4, my final ruffle will be 154 inches in length. And that's going to be, so 4 inches by 154 inches for tier 4. Now, When I first started out, I had to decide how long I wanted my skirt, which worked in my favor and gave me the 9-inch tiers anyways. If you have longer legs, you have a short torso, you need to figure out how long you want your skirt to be. So I wanted my skirt to be about 30, little over 30 inches, which is why it's about 33 inches with my measurements. And that takes it to like just above my ankle. And that works for me. If you want something longer, if you want something shorter, if you want more tiers, if you want less tiers, this is up for you to figure out. You just take your length, so you need the length of your skirt with the your hip measurements, and that will give you everything that you need to measure this out. So you have the length of your skirt, with your hip measurement. So I'm just going to put hip measure. And that's how you can figure out your tiers. You just take the length and divide it up into how many tiers that you want, and then go around doing this. So I was doing this on the fly as I was cutting out my fabric because I didn't know what I wanted at the time. So as I was cutting everything out and figuring out how much fabric I had, this is what I got. I had plenty of fabric left over, but for this particular skirts I had 4 yards of fabric. So I had 2 yards in the they're not necessarily stripes, and then I had 2 yards in the dots, and that's how I got all this figured out and done. So let's go ahead and get on to making the skirt. Okay, here I'm showing you the fabric that I have already cut out. I didn't record this, I had to cut it out downstairs on my dining room table. And you can see the post-it notes in there. I have it labeled tiers 1, 2, 3, and 4 with their measurements on top. Now you'll notice tier 3 and tier 4 actually have different measurements because it was in the process of this getting ready to sew it all together when I realized I cut out too much fabric. And so I had to go back and remeasure my strips to make sure that was the correct measurements. So as a beginner sewer, just to let you guys know, when you buy quilting cotton, it's usually 44 inches wide, which means it's folded in half on the bolt. So when you fold your fabric in half lengthwise, it's about 20 to 22 inches wide. So when I cut these out, I had it folded in half on my dining room table and then measured out from the fold line. So when I cut them out, I cut out the width and then I just cut across the entire thing. I just piled it all together and didn't realize I had actually cut out too much. So because of this, when you cut out the strips, you're going to have more than one strip. For tier 1, I had 2 strips of fabric. For tier 2, I had like 2 and a little bit more. For tier 3, I had more. So what I'm doing, I'm taking the ends from selvage to selvage and I'm pinning them together, because at this point I'm going to have to sew them together before I am able to put the rest of the skirt together. So all my tiers are going to be sewn, these strips are going to be sewn into a circle. All the edges will be sewn up, and then we will then at that point put the tiers together. And you can see here as I'm doing the top tier that it's definitely wider than the rest of my tiers, because I have my 9 inches of the actual tier, my seam allowance, and that extra inch for casing. Alright, so here I go at my sewing machine, sewing up my edges together, and just 1/2 inch seam allowance, sewing them all together, and then moving on to the next one. So now that I have the edges sewn together, I also took the time and used my serger, and I serged the top edge of the top tier. This is the edge that where my casing would be, so I'll just fold it over and sew it down for my casing. So as you can see, I only serged the top edge. I did not serge the bottom edge because once I get the second tier attached to it, then I would serge it or overcast it all together at one time. So right now I have this little measuring stick. It usually comes in beginner's kits, and I'm not actually sure what it's called, but I'm using that to measure out 1 inch or 1 1/4 inches because I have that seam allowance there, or 1.5 inches for the seam allowance. Anyways, I'm measuring out 1 inch so that I can pin it all in place and then sew it up, leaving a gap so I can put my elastic in at a later date. Okay, so there's the top tier. It's all sewn together, and it's all pinned together and measured out. Now I'm going down to the bottom tier where the hem is. I serge the bottom only on one side because then I'm going to fold it up and stitch it in place. So I'm going to go ahead and hem the skirt on that strip of fabric before I even put the skirt together. That way I don't have to worry about having a gigantic skirt full of fabric, hemming it all up when it's just easier to do it now while it's a separate piece. So here you can see that I have sewn the casing down, still leaving the bottom edge raw for adding the tier, but I have sewn down the casing. Looks nice. Left a gap, that's where my finger is. I left a gap there so we can put the elastic in at a later time. Here is the bottom tier. I went ahead and sewed the hemming, so I just did a double fold. I had originally serged it, and then I folded over the serged edge and then folded it over again. So the serged edge is now hidden inside the hem, and I just went ahead and hemmed it all up. Now we got that out of the way and I don't have to deal with it anymore. So what I'm doing now is I'm using my sewing machine to do a long basting stitch at the top of every tier. So at the top of the second tier, the third tier, and the fourth tier, I am doing an extra large basting stitch because that's how I'm going to gather my ruffles. So you see right here that top tier has my casing, but I still left that bottom edge raw. The second tier, I don't know if you can see it, you see that pin I have there, but there's a long basting stitch there at the top, and I have it anchored with that pin so the threads won't come loose, and the bottom of that strip is raw. And the third tier, you can see the stitching there for definitely, and then the bottom of that strip is left raw too because there's no need to gather there. And then the fourth tier and last tier has this basting stitch at the top, and then the hemming has already been done at the bottom. Okay, so first things first, on that strip, so tier 2, I folded in half because each side has a seam. Then I folded it in half and marked with the pin the middle. So see here on tier 1, I'm folding it in half and marking with pins the middle points. So I'm going to match up the pins to make it easier to gather together. So I have the two sides with the seams, and then I have 2 pins in the middle. Just like that. I'll leave that open. Now you have to have your right sides together, slip the tier in, and then you match up pin to pin or side seam to side seam if you marked it that way. So what I'm doing is I am matching up quadrants of each tier. So it's been folded in half, so you should have 4 marks because you need a quarter your tier to be able to match everything up. I'll pin those marks together, and the tier 2, the dots here, is going to be much larger than tier 1. So what I did, I left long tails at the beginning and the ending of each stitching, and I went completely around in the circle, and I put a pin in place to anchor the threads, so when I start pulling the bobbin thread to gather my stitches, it won't pull loose from the pin. So I put the pin in, and then I just do like this S-wrap of those extra threads around it. And then when I start pulling the bobbin thread from the other end of the stitching, it'll all gather up and it won't pull loose. And it's just easier to divide each piece into quarters. That way, if each piece is divided into quarters, you can ease it in more equally, so the fullness is distributed equally between the tiers. Instead of having more ruffles on one side than on the other, you can just do the best that you can to get all your ruffles equal around. Okay, so now I'm going to sew. I'm getting my machine ready because that base was just in the way. So while I'm sewing, you can see I have the tier with the ruffles on the bottom, and I have the tier that doesn't have the ruffles on the top. So as you sew, those ruffles on the bottom, the feed dogs help ease in those ruffles so they're distributed a little more equally into that top tier, tier 1. I hope I'm making sense to you guys, because I'm watching this as I go and it makes perfect sense to me, but as a beginner you guys may not understand, so make sure you throw your comments down below, your questions, so I can answer them as best as I can. And while I'm sewing, I'm always trying to make sure my cut edges align, that they line up together. Even though I have all those ruffles underneath, I always try to make sure my cut edges are aligned so that you always keep the width as much as you can. So here we go. So there's tier 1 and tier 2 sewn together. You see the ruffles. It's not a lot, but it's enough. Works for me. And here we go on to adding tier 3 to tier 2. So I'm just pre-ruffling, pre-gathering I should say, not ruffling. I'm pre-gathering everything together, and you can see I have my red pins there, so I have this fabric already quartered and marked so that I can slip it in and continue on. Right here I'm showing you I have the raw edges, and I'm going to take a moment and go serge those edges before I add another tier, because it's easier to do it now than it is when you have the full skirt done. Oh, there you go. Serged edges. This is cotton quilting, so it will fray, and this is to keep it from fraying and still keep the inside of your skirt looking nice. So here I am quartering the fabric. I'm going to mark my 2 side seams, which is the sewn sides that I already have, so I don't mark those because I'm just using the edges themselves. So 2 seams right there, and then the 2 middle marks right there. And this time around, instead of using a pin, I'm taking a snip out of the seam allowance. It's a small snip so that you can see the gap. It's like cutting out a triangle. So when I am pinning, I can see that triangle instead of having pins in the way, because sometimes pins become a little too much. So there I am pinning everything. Now I'm pinning in place the quarters. Okay, so like I said, I ruffled, so I had pulled everything together in the beginning. Once I have it all pinned together, I have each quarter pinned to each quarter on each tier. I start undoing the ruffles. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make the fabric fit into those specific measurements. And the bottom tier is going to be much longer than the top tier, so there's going to be ruffles. And I'm just trying to even them out to make sure they look nice and lovely. And then I'm pinning it all in place. Sometimes you might find that you have more ruffles on one side than you do the other, or that maybe your thread has come undone and you just have flat fabric. So you just do the best you can. Because honestly, nobody's going to notice if you make a mistake. You're the only one who's going to know that you've made a mistake, and it's going to be on your mind. But everybody else who sees you wearing your skirt or whatever other piece of clothing that you might have, no one's going to notice. Okay, so right here I lost some of my thread, so it didn't ruffle. So I'm just going in and pleating it myself. I'm gathering it in the middle, and then in the middle on each side, and then on the middle again, till it's all pinned out and equally distributed. So I sewed it up. There's tiers 1, 2, and 3. There you go. And the edges have been serged as well. So now I just need to add tier 4. Oh yeah, and if there's any threads, trim your threads, your loose ends. Okay, so here we go again. I'm quartering my fabric and making marks either with pins or snips so that I can then do the same thing with my bottom tier and then match it all up. So you can kind of see I've done it kind of different ways, where I gathered it before I put it in, and this time I'm putting it in before I gather it, and here I am gathering it in process. And you have to be careful, because if you tug too hard, if your fabric doesn't slide easily on your thread and you tug too hard, you'll break your thread, and then that might cause you to have to redo the basting stitch again, and that's always a pain in the butt. So you just need to pay attention and be gentle as you're doing your gathering. And if you do happen to bust your thread, it's okay. Don't freak out over it. Take a breath, walk away if you need to, and then come back at a later time to do it again. But just be gentle mostly. Kind of makes me wish I could work this fast in real time. Tea break, woo! Or wait, I don't think that was tea, I think that was apple cider. Apple cider break. It was chilly that day, which is so funny. So it was chilly when I made the skirt, and I wore it out anyways. I think I'm going to wear it during the winter. I'll just put on some leggings underneath, or I'm thinking about leg warmers. I think I might crochet myself some leg warmers anyway. I'm finally at the point in my time in my life where I really don't care what other people think. I really like the skirt, and if I'm going to wear it out in winter, I want to have warm legs too. So it's either flannel tights or leggings. And I don't know, I think leggings would be kind of fun. Talk about bringing the 80s back. I don't know, what do you guys think? Would you do leggings? I'm watching Designing Women again. I'm kind of liking some of their costume design there on Designing Women. Totally 80s. But I don't know. It's kind of appealing to me. Maybe that's me showing my age. I don't know. Ooh, I'm almost done. Thank goodness I'm almost done with all this pinning up and getting the gathers together. Alright, so there we go. All pinned up and ready to sew on that last ruffle. Here we go. So I have my hand underneath the tiers to make sure that I'm pulling the bottom tier and making sure that it's lining up with the top tier. And I'm taking my time. So I've got this fast forwarding through all of it. A lot of pins involved, a lot of fabric that can get in the way. You don't want to sew any other tiers together, so you just take your time and pay attention and make sure that you're relaxed and having fun. As you can see, you probably see headphones on my head. I don't know what I was listening to, as other music or podcasts. And sipping on my apple cider. Oh yeah. And as you can see, just a reminder for the newbies, I'm taking my pins out before I run over them. I know you see a lot of people who'll run over your pins. Don't do that, because if you run over your pins, your needle can either break, and sometimes those needles, when they break, they'll fly out at you, or you can damage your machine that way. So I do not recommend sewing over the pins. I always take them out before I sew over them. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen sometimes, but I always try my best to be a good seamstress and take the pins out first. So now I've got to put my elastic in, and I have this gigantic safety pin, which is, you can actually get in the quilting section of your local craft stores, because they use it to pin layers together when they quilt. And I'm using this pin to, oh, you can kind of see it right there. I'm using the pin, which I've put through the end of my elastic, and I use it to pull my elastic through, as you can see. So I use one hand to push the sewing pin in, and I use the other hand to hold on to it while I push the fabric across the sewing pin and the elastic. Now this elastic I had pre-measured around my waist, and I thought it was comfortable and thought it was good. And so I'm going to sew up the ends. But wait, I'm not done yet, because then I had to try on my skirt. So there we go. I'm going to sew up the ends just like that, and I'll be right back. Okay, so I sewed up the ends, and I tried on the skirt, and I found that my elastic was too big. So you see where the pin is, where I'm marking right there? I had to snip off like 2.5 inches, I think it was, because it was just too big. So I pulled the elastic till it was comfortable, pinned it in place, snipped it off, re-sewed it together, and so now I'm showing you where I'm going to sew here again on the back side. Okay, so now the waist is all done. I sewed the casing shut so that the seam lines match on the outside, and I did an extra stitch. So I sewed the casing shut first, and then I sewed the top line after you sew the bottom. What this does, it catches the elastic in a tight tunnel so it won't twist. If you give your elastic too much room, it'll twist in the waistband, and we don't want that. So not only did I sew the casing closed, I went and top stitched. I pushed the elastic down against the seam and then did a stitch around the top so that the elastic wouldn't move. And then I'm just trimming all my threads, making sure it all looks good. And there I am wearing my skirt. And I don't wear it with my shirt tucked in. So, did you guys enjoy the video? Were my explanations and my instruction, did you guys understand it? Do you see what I was trying to get at? I'm hoping that you guys were able to enjoy the video, and it may take a while to make the skirt with all that gathering and pinning the ruffles and everything else, but the skirt ends up really cute when you're done with it. And you don't have to have it as long as mine. I wanted 4 tiers, but if you want 2 tiers, if you want 3 tiers, if you want 4 tiers and you just want them not so wide, they want them shorter, you know, you just, all you have to do is figure out how long you want your skirt and then divide the skirt that length up into however many tiers you want. And it is really super simple. Anyways, I hope you guys really enjoyed the video, and as always, to support my channel, all you have to do is share it and hit that like button, throw your comments down below, and as always, supplies are listed down below through those Amazon links, and that's another way to help support me. And I appreciate everything that you guys do for me, and I'm already working on my next video. I'm actually going to take a dress and I'm going to convert it into a top and to a bottom, and we'll see how that works out for me. So I will see you guys in the next video. Not sure when. I will just see you in the next video.